Hi guys, my name is Nick, and last May I had the quintessential New York City experience. My landlord raised the rent, and I got kicked out of my apartment. But on the plus side, I got this really cool idea for our project. So what I decided to research was why the rent prices of New York City housing is beginning to skyrocket. And some of the variables that I decided to focus on was the wealth distribution and income distribution within both New York City and the country as a whole. I also decided more specifically to focus on the availability of housing within New York City. Now, as I was pulling data off of the census and off of the American Community Housing Survey, it was very rarely in the type of format that would be friendly for a pivot table or for a dashboard. So to fix this, I came up with this formula right here, and it is a VLOOKUP function that is nested inside of an if-then function. And what this tells Excel to do, essentially, is to look within the row that I gave it, that I specified, and if the value of negative 11,971 is within that row, which it is, then it would return the first column in that row, and that would be x is less than 35. And what this allowed me to do is allow me to pull this data, which was segmented into columns, and put it into this single column very quickly. Now, once I had it into this format, it was very friendly for a pivot table and for a dashboard. Before we go to our dashboard, though, I wanted to show you this chart, which is the supply of housing in New York City. Now, the price of rent is going to be determined primarily by two things: the demand for those apartments and the supply of those apartments. Now, the supply of those apartments are going to be really easy to track because the American Community Survey does estimates and surveys every single year. And here we have the surveys from 2011 to 2014. And the first thing I want to point out to you is the blue bars right here. And these blue bars represent total housing, and you can see that they barely move over these 4 years. The other really important thing that I wanted to show you in this graph was the rental vacancy rate. And the rental vacancy rate also not only doesn't move, but remains at this very low 2.25%. And with the vacancy rate so low at 2.25%, there's going to be really little incentive for someone who owns an apartment to drop the rental price. Now, with that in mind, I want to take you to this dashboard, which is New York City wealth distribution by quintile and year. And this is going to be one of the factors that influence the demand for New York City housing, right? Because the more wealth people have, then the more they can spend on that housing. And that's going to affect the price of the housing and then therefore also the rent. Now, at first you might be looking at this dashboard and you might be saying, oh, there's way too much information on it. But that's okay, right? That's kind of the purpose of the dashboard. It allows you to have this diagram which has way more information, and then you can narrow it down to see trends just among whatever information you want to slice. So let's do a slice, right? And here I have the first quintile and the fifth quintile for both years, 2000 to 2011. And as we can see, if you were in the fifth quintile, so if you were above the 80th percentile in wealth at the beginning of the turn of the century, then you did pretty well during the 11 years that followed, right? We can see that most of these bars on the 2011 are generally higher than they are on the 2000, and that's especially true for these later bars here, right? 75 and over, 70 to 74 years of age, and 65 to 65 and over. So not only if you were in the upper quintile, but also of the older demographic, then you were the ones who made out the best during these last 11 years. But although this graph that I showed you right before does show how unequally distributed the wealth might be between the first quintile and the fifth quintile, I do think that the graph hides some pretty important facts. So I'm going to go to just the first quintile now. And what you can see right here is that not only is the wealth unequally distributed, but from 2000 to 2011, the first quintile actually falls deeper into debt. So right here you can see that for the yellow bar, which is non-existent, for age 55 to 64 years old, that is the age group at which the first quintile actually finally breaks even in their net wealth, whereas previously that would happen somewhere from 45 to 54 years of age back at the year 2000. And so now I want to show you one other major theme of this graph, which is that not only was the last 11 years worse for the first quintile or the lower quintiles than it was for the higher quintiles, but it was also very uneven if you look at the age cohorts, right? So here I'm going to compare the age group younger than 35 to the age group that is over 75, right? And here we can see that no matter what quintile you want to look at, those of the older demographic did much better during these 11 years than their younger counterparts. Right, so if you were young, like I pointed out before, being in the first quintile meant almost doubling your debt during these 11 years. While if you were in the fifth quintile, being in the youngest demographic just meant that your wealth wasn't going to increase. And the inequality between the quintiles and the age cohorts pretty much sums up this chart right here. Now let's take a look at the result of the supply and demand, and that will be the rent prices for New York City by boroughs and year. Now, I'm going to warn you, when you look at the data with this many bars, it's going to mask a lot of the patterns that you would be able to find if you were to start slicing it to more specific data. In fact, when you look at it from all the way zoned out like this, the only discernible pattern you can see, really, is that Manhattan's category of $1,500 or more continues to expand from 2011 to 2013. That probably has a lot to do with Bloomberg's upzoning of the entire city, pretty much, during this period of time. But now let's actually start to delve into the data with a little bit more detail and look at the price range from $200 to $750. So as you can see that for 4 of the 5 boroughs, right, for the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, the number of units from $500 to $750 is going to decrease during these 3 years. And that's going to be in line with the general theme of gentrification that's happening in those 4 boroughs. That's also not happening on Staten Island. Similarly, now if we look at the $1,500 or more, as well as the $1,000 to $1,499 or more, you have a very similar idea of gentrification, right? So they're not all gentrifying equally. As you can see here, Manhattan and Brooklyn are gentrifying the most quickly. Probably Brooklyn might even be gentrifying a little bit faster, because if you look at the difference in the bars in relation to the length of the bars, you can see that Brooklyn is actually, as a percentage-wise, probably added twice as many apartments in the 1,500 or more category. Similarly, you can see Staten Island doesn't really gentrify as much. That's probably because of the lack of transportation. And so the last chart that I wanted to show you is this one right here, the U.S. income distribution, right? And the first thing I want to show you is the x-axis down here. And we can see that that goes from 1967 to 2014, as opposed to our dashboard graphs, which were all in the 21st century. And now, while this graph does depict growing inequality within the U.S., if you really want to compare it to the dashboard graphs, you would have to change your view and only look from 1997 to 2014. And when you consider only those variables, right, you can see that both the Gini principle and the income of the different percentiles remains relatively constant, or only becomes slightly more unequal during this period. And that's important, because it proves that even though the U.S. income distribution might be becoming only slightly more unequal, that New York City's wealth distribution is becoming dramatically more unequal. So in fact, you might have an exacerbation of the country's phenomenon within New York City, and that will increase rent prices even more.